want you to picture something for a second. Imagine waking up in your own neighborhood, but the basic rules of survival have just completely changed. You step outside, and the air is thick with this like very specific silent tension. You've just spent 6 hours standing in the baking sun, just hoping to get a single loaf of bread.
Only to reach the front of the line and find the shelves entirely empty.
Exactly. And your phone buzzes, and it's a massive, frantic text thread trying to track down cooking oil 3 towns over.
Yeah, the daily exhaustion of that is just staggering.
It really is. And beneath all of this daily exhaustion, there's a quiet, gnawing fear in the minds of ordinary people. It's a fear of speaking out, of the power grid failing for the 15th hour today. And it is slowly, inevitably mixing with a rising, undeniable anger.
So I want you to ask yourself, what happens when a system is pushed to its absolute structural breaking point? It's a deeply visceral reality. When a society reaches that specific frequency of tension, where the currency in your pocket loses its value by the hour and the infrastructure is literally crumbling around you, every single day feels like holding your breath.
Yeah, like you're just waiting for the snap.
Precisely. You're just waiting for it to break. The psychological toll of that kind of sustained pressure is immense.
And that feeling, that slow-burning fuse, is the core of what we are looking at today. Welcome to today's Deep Dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
We're exploring some incredibly dense, intense analysis regarding the future of Cuba. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore 3 distinct, highly volatile scenarios for the nation's future.
Right. The document we're looking at really lays out 3 distinct paths.
Yeah, we're looking at internal reform, total institutional collapse, and the chaotic process of rebirth. And more importantly, we're going to examine the actual mechanics of these scenarios.
Because it's not just theory, right?
Exactly. What do they mean for the people living on the ground and for the world watching from afar?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the trajectory we're looking at usually doesn't start with a sudden explosion.
No, it rarely does.
It starts with a government desperately trying to release the scheme.
That's the first pathway we need to analyze, which is internal reform.
Right.
The idea here is that the current socialist regime is, well, they're acutely aware that the pressure cooker is about to blow.
They have to be.
Yeah. So to prevent a total uprising, they attempt to implement certain economic reforms designed specifically to ease that crushing day-to-day pressure on citizens.
Like, what kind of reforms are we talking about here?
Well, we've seen glimpses of this in recent years, actually, allowing small and medium-sized private enterprises to operate or, letting citizens buy and sell certain goods on the open market.
But I have to ask about the mechanics of that. Is this just putting a tiny bandage on a bursting dam?
That is the big question, because it feels like trying to cool down an overheating engine by just opening the hood instead of actually fixing the broken radiator. I mean, you might get a brief blast of cool air, but the engine is still fundamentally broken and going to melt down eventually.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a great analogy.
If the pressure is as intense as the analysis describes, like the empty shelves, the triple-digit inflation, the rolling blackouts, is a limited economic concession really going to fix the structural integrity of the nation? Or is it just hitting snooze on the crisis?
What's fascinating here is the fierce debate surrounding the regime's ultimate dilemma. Are these internal reforms actually strong enough to prevent a systemic collapse, or do they merely delay the inevitable?
Right, because they're not changing the core system.
Exactly. You have to look at the mechanisms of power. In a centralized socialist state, the government maintains political control largely through economic control.
Okay, that makes sense.
If the state provides your food rations, your housing, and your meager salary, they have the ultimate leverage over your behavior.
Because if you protest, you lose your livelihood.
Precisely. Now imagine the state implements these internal reforms. They allow private businesses to flourish. Suddenly, a citizen is making their money independently.
They aren't relying on the state's ration book to feed their family anymore.
Right. And the moment you give a population economic independence, you fundamentally weaken your political leash on them. So the regime faces a massive tension.
A catch-22.
Exactly. They desperately want to alleviate the strain on daily life so the society doesn't revolt, but they are absolutely terrified of losing their grip on power.
Which means they end up half-stepping. Like they loosen the grip just a tiny bit, but the moment a private business gets too successful or too independent, the government panics and taxes them into oblivion or changes the regulations overnight.
That is the exact trap outlined in the sources. If you loosen the grip too much to fix the economy, you risk a Soviet-style unraveling.
Oh, like what happened with Gorbachev.
Yeah. Think of Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost in the 1980s. The reforms that were intended to save the system ended up dismantling it entirely. But if you keep the grip too tight to maintain control, the economic reforms are choked out, the foreign investors stay away, and the citizens continue to starve. It is a precarious, almost impossible balancing act.
And because that balancing act is so fragile, it forces us to look at what happens when the engine actually blows. Because eventually, the half measures fail.
The tension has to go somewhere.
Exactly. That brings us to the breaking point, which is total institutional collapse.
This is where the trajectory accelerates dramatically. A collapse doesn't just happen overnight in a vacuum. It's a specific chain reaction.
Where does it usually start?
It often starts with tightening external pressure, specifically U.S. sanctions and embargo mechanics.
Right, because they are so heavily reliant on, or rather restricted by, those external factors.
Exactly. When access to international banking is choked off and foreign aid from allies like Venezuela or Russia dries up, the internal economy just suffocates. The informal exchange rate for the local currency creators?
The cracks spread rapidly beneath the surface. I mean, you can't import oil, so the power plants shut down.
And when the power goes out for 18 hours a day, the food in people's refrigerators rots. That external weight deepens the existing social rifts on the inside.
Which leads to people taking to the streets.
Yeah, voices grow louder. We saw a prelude to this during the historic July 11th protests a few years ago. It's not just an isolated incident, it's a compounding of public unrest.
Right.
People organizing through encrypted messaging apps, bypassing state media. The system is pushed so hard from so many directions that the state security apparatus simply gets overwhelmed and gives way.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because when we talk about institutional collapse or, regime change in think pieces, it is so easy to treat it as an abstract, sterile political science concept.
Oh, absolutely. It becomes just theory.
Yeah, we look at it as a headline on a news ticker.
Yeah.
But the analysis brings in this incredibly cinematic human element. Think about the young families and the people running those new small businesses caught right in the middle of this historic crossfire.
The human cost of a state collapse is profound. The moment the central authority vanishes, the police stop answering calls.
The supply chains completely freeze.
Yeah, everything just stops.
Imagine you are a young parent in Havana. For you, regime collapse isn't some geopolitical chess match. It is a terrifying leap into the dark.
You're just trying to keep your kids safe.
Right. You are sitting in a sweltering apartment during an internet blackout, hearing shouts in the street, not knowing if the military is going to fire on the crowds. There is a profound, paralyzing anxiety.
Because your entire reality, the rules of your daily survival, are gone.
Exactly. But right alongside that visceral fear is a sudden, wild hope. The intoxicating possibility that maybe, just maybe, you won't have to spend the rest of your life standing in line for rations.
It's the ultimate uncertainty. Every single safety net, no matter how frayed or broken it was, is suddenly gone. But so is the ceiling.
Right.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that chaotic uncertainty doesn't just stay on the island. When a foundational system collapses just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, it creates a massive geopolitical vacuum.
It's not just a local issue anymore.
No, the analysis raises vital questions about the earthquake this would trigger globally.
Because nature hates a vacuum, and geopolitics hates it even more.
Exactly. Think about the immediate mechanics of a collapse. Do you see a mass migration event with hundreds of thousands of people taking to the sea on makeshift rafts out of sheer desperation?
Which we've seen echoes of before, but maybe not on this scale.
Right. How does the U.S. Coast Guard respond to that? Do transnational cartels attempt to move in and use the island as a new operational hub while the police force is disbanded?
Or does the U.S. intervene militarily to secure the island, which opens up an entirely different Pandora's box of historical trauma and international backlash?
Those are the exact calculations happening in war rooms right now. Furthermore, what happens to the broader socialist model in the region?
Right, because Cuba has been such an anchor for that ideology.
Exactly. If a historical cornerstone like Cuba falls, does the entire regional architecture, countries that have relied on its medical diplomacy or intelligence apparatus, begin to shake?
It's a domino effect.
The collapse of a state is never contained within its own borders. It sends shockwaves out, and it pulls external actors in.
Which logically forces us to look at what fills that void. I mean, you can't live in a state of total collapse forever, Someone eventually takes charge, laws are rewritten, and a new economy is formed.
A new status quo has to emerge.
Yeah, and that moves us directly into the messy, chaotic reality of what comes next. The transition to a new system. Specifically, the leap into democracy and a raw capitalist economy.
The promised benefits of this transition are highly compelling on paper, according to the sources.
Sure, on paper.
Right. If the island successfully transitions, it suddenly opens up to global economic integration. You lift the embargoes, you see a potential flood of international investment.
Hotel chains, agricultural tech, telecommunications companies eager to build out a modern grid.
Yeah, all of that. The ultimate driving force behind this theoretical transition is improving the living standards of everyday citizens by giving them access to the global market.
But the mechanisms of getting from point A to point B are brutal. The analysis pivots hard to the risks, and it is a heavy list. Political instability, the dismantling of state subsidies, overnight price liberalization.
It's a massive shock to the system.
So what does this all mean? It's like tearing down the house you live in to build a new one, but you have to sleep in the rubble while it happens?
That is a highly accurate way to visualize economic shock therapy. You're dismantling an entire way of life while millions of people are still trying to survive within it.
And it makes me question the psychological readiness of the population. We're talking about people who've been accustomed to a highly centralized system for generations.
It's all they've known.
Yes, the system was failing them, but it provided certain baseline guarantees, right? Free, if crumbling, healthcare, free education, state-subsidized housing. Are they truly ready to absorb the sudden, violent shock of raw capitalism?
This raises an important question, and it's a fierce debate among economists and historians in the source material. When you introduce raw capitalism into a previously closed system, it brings investment, yes, but it also brings brutal, overnight inequality.
Because there's no gradual adjustment period.
Exactly. Think about the mechanics of property rights in a transitional Cuba. Who gets to own the prime real estate in Havana?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Is it the citizens currently living in those dilapidated mansions, or is it the descendants of the families who fled to Miami in 1959, returning with high-priced lawyers to reclaim their ancestral homes?
That is a recipe for catastrophic social conflict. You are instantly creating massive classes of winners and losers. If you happen to have family in Miami sending you dollars, you can buy business and become part of the new upper class overnight.
But on the flip side,
right, if you are an elderly person relying on a state pension that just became mathematically worthless due to price liberalization, you might literally starve.
Which is exactly why the analysis asks whether this newly transitioned nation will emerge as a shining model of democracy and capitalism in the Caribbean, or if it is doomed to face a catastrophic failure in its initial attempts.
Have we seen this kind of transition play out before?
We have. Look at the transition of Russia in the 1990s. The rapid privatization didn't create a thriving, equitable, free market.
It created the oligarchs.
Exactly. It created a class of ultra-wealthy oligarchs who simply bought up all the state assets for pennies, while the average citizen suffered through hyperinflation and organized crime.
It's the stark difference between a textbook economic transition and the incredibly messy reality of human behavior and greed.
And there is another vital layer of complexity here regarding the transition itself. Will the current government, or remnants of the military, actually allow a democratic transition to happen peacefully?
It seems unlikely.
Well, they might dig in, utilizing their control over the military and intelligence sectors to ensure they become the new oligarchs.
Ah, so they just rebrand.
Exactly. They might embrace capitalist markets while maintaining an iron grip on political dissent, similar to certain models we've seen in Asia. The analysis presents these wildly different trajectories, one of rapid, painful integration and one of prolonged, agonizing conflict over who controls the new wealth.
And whether they sleep in that rubble for 6 months or 2 decades, the success or failure of that massive transition doesn't just affect the people on the island.
Which brings us to the final major theme we need to pull from this analysis today, which is the global ripple effect.
The perspective really zooms out here to look at the long-term impact on the socialist model globally.
Okay.
The underlying question is this: if a nation that has been such a prominent, defiant symbol of socialism for over 6 decades either collapses or radically transforms a system, while other nations following a similar ideological model face irresistible pressure from their own citizens to change.
Like, does it break the psychological spell? Exactly. Does it prove that the system is inherently flawed?
I have to jump in and challenge how we interpret that because I think it's tempting to oversimplify. Is a Cuban transition actually a universal lesson for the rest of the world? Or is it a highly unique, isolated anomaly?
That's a very fair point to raise.
Look at the specific mechanics of their history. We are talking about an island nation located just 90 miles from the largest capitalist superpower on Earth.
Right.
Its economy has been historically strangled by incredibly specific, intense U.S. embargoes and very particular regional dynamics. Can a country halfway across the world in completely different geopolitical circumstances really look at a Cuban transition and say, oh, that's exactly what is going to happen to us?
It is a critical distinction to make, and the analysis remains very objective, weighing both sides of that exact debate.
So what does the other side say?
Well, on one side of the argument, the domino effect theory suggests that, yes, ideological models are deeply interconnected. When a major historical pillar shifts, it creates a powerful psychological precedent.
It shows it's possible.
Right. It demonstrates to populations in other highly centralized nations that a rigid, seemingly permanent system can actually give way. It provides a blueprint for dissent.
It pierces the armor of invincibility.
Precisely. But on the other side of the debate, the analysis heavily acknowledges the specific geographic and historical variables you just mentioned.
Because you can't ignore the U.S. factor.
Exactly. It questions the outsized role of the international community and the United States in particular in shaping this future. If Cuba's trajectory is primarily dictated by its geographic proximity to Miami, the influence of the diaspora, and the mechanics of a 60-year embargo, then its future, whether that is a total collapse or a messy rebirth, might be a highly distinct, localized phenomenon.
Not a universal blueprint for the fall of socialism.
Right. The analysis doesn't declare a definitive winner in this debate. It merely makes it clear that the international community will be forced to react one way or the other to the shockwaves.
The world will absolutely be watching. Which brings us back to where we started today. We've walked through an incredibly cinematic yet intensely real arc laid out by our sources.
It really is a heavy narrative to process.
Yeah. We started with the visceral reality of a society holding its breath, waiting in lines, watching the power grid fail. We looked at the overheating engine of internal reform and the regime's impossible balancing act between economic survival and political control.
And then the inevitable break.
Right. We witnessed the breaking point, the collapse of institutions, the paralyzed anxiety, and the profound human cost of that freefall. We navigated a chaotic, rubble-filled rebirth into raw capitalism, with its promises of foreign investment and its severe threats of brutal, overnight inequality.
Which is a transition fraught with peril.
And finally, we zoomed out to examine the global shockwaves, debating whether this historic shift would serve as a worldwide blueprint or a geographic anomaly.
It is a staggering trajectory to consider. Moving from the hyper-local reality of trying to find cooking oil on a Tuesday all the way to the tectonic shifting of global ideologies.
It really is. And I want to connect this back to you, the listener. Think about your own life, your family, your career, your daily routines. How would you navigate your world if the foundational systems, the very rules of the economic and political game you've played by your entire life, were suddenly shifting underneath your feet?
It's hard to even imagine.
It is.
Yeah.
How do you balance the terrifying anxiety of losing your safety nets with the sudden wild hope of a completely unwritten future?
It's the ultimate test of human adaptability, finding a way to survive while the ground is literally moving.
It really is. And it leaves me with one final unresolved thought inspired by our dive into these sources today. We spent a lot of time talking about the mechanics of systems, currency devaluations, and political frameworks. But if a nation completely transitions to a new system overnight, what happens to the generations who spent their entire lives building, believing in, sacrificing for, and surviving under the old one?
That's the human element. You can't just legislate away.
Exactly. You can change the Constitution. You can privatize the markets that open the borders to investment. But can a nation's soul be reformed and transitioned as easily as its economy? Something to think about. Until next time.